Today I'm going to try to break down redlining into simple terms and almost the style of a video essay, but broken up into multiple videos because I'm pretty sure if I tried to make a 30-minute video, my computer would die. This section of videos mainly focuses on effects of Black Americans because that is the main demographic of most redlining research, but also because of the historical explanations for it. But most racial minorities are affected, if not equally, by housing discrimination and other adverse effects relating to redlining. So let's start with some history. The American Civil War ended in 1865, and the abolition of slavery triggered a great migration of African Americans across the nation. As many African Americans flocked to northern industrial cities, Congress passed a Civil Rights Act in 1866 that banned actions that denied the rights of citizenship based on race. But shortly after this court ruling, the Supreme Court also permitted legal segregation of Black and white Americans in Plessy v. Ferguson, which you would think was counterproductive to the denying of civil rights, but under the idea of separate but equal, segregation was allowed. The increase of African American housing due to migration and the legalization of segregation introduced the idea of redlining. The practice of redlining emerged from the ranking system the HOLC used to determine areas eligible for loans, where predominantly Black communities were outlined in red in the HOLC maps to signify that they had received the lowest rankings and were thus ineligible for loans. HOLC stands for the Homeowners Loan Corporation, so they basically determined what areas were better for investment. And redlining fundamentally contradicted the separate but equal rule that existed in education, public transportation, and housing by making a system where private lending businesses could deny services based on race. After a decade of segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson was overruled, but following the Supreme Court's 1954 decision invalidating separate but equal public education, Birchmans Fitzpatrick, general counsel of the Housing and Home Finance Agency, stated that this decision did not apply to housing, which is kind of a contradiction in itself, because it allowed for housing discrimination and redlining to persist. Where city planners would often make separate spaces for Black residents to keep them out of exclusive housing for white occupancy, despite the national movement towards unsegregated public spaces. Redlining, by definition, is a discriminatory practice of outlining undesirable neighborhoods when considering real estate investment. Based on these evaluations, risky neighborhoods would be less likely to receive mortgage loans and development. Racial discrimination is often disguised in housing as not wanting to take on risky tenants, but many neutral requirements were misapplied for Black real estate clients to justify denial and riskiness. Like saying, oh, your FICO score is too low, or oh, your job isn't stable enough, and then turn around and approve a white client with a lower FICO score and a more inconsistent job. Housing discrimination also followed Black residents to a lot of other aspects of life, which I will address later, as many whites automatically assume that neighborhoods with many Blacks have poor schools, much crime, and few stores. These whites are not necessarily responding to the presence of Blacks per se. Black neighborhoods simply are assumed to be bad neighborhoods and are avoided as a result. And that is a quote from Farley on page 36. The lack of investment in minority neighborhoods leads to stereotyping and the furthering of segregation due to inequality of resources. Late 20th century housing discrimination was often diminished in scale by the amount of legislation that was passed to combat it, but the Fair Housing Act was not a foolproof piece of legislation, as private discrimination continued to take place after the 70s, and although there were no federal laws preventing minorities from living anywhere, discrimination and segregation from these previous trends continued to take place.